Welcome back to The Explainer. When we think of the American Revolutionary War, our minds usually jump straight to those iconic paintings, right? You know, the founding fathers in powdered wigs signing declarations, or generals standing proudly on smoky battlefields. But today, we're going to look right past those familiar scenes. We are uncovering the messy, deeply human reality of the war. We're heading to the hidden front lines to reveal how this massive global conflict actually impacted the diverse and often marginalized groups whose stories rarely make it to the center of the frame. So I want to kick things off by asking you a really direct question. Who actually fought the American Revolution? Because if you look at the raw data and the demographic realities of the 13 colonies, that image of a unified army of gentlemen farmers fighting purely for abstract ideals, well, it starts to fracture. Instead, I want you to imagine the diverse groups, women, enslaved people, Native Americans who were actively involved and very often forced right onto the front lines of this conflict.
Okay, here is our roadmap for today's explainer. First, a complex civil war. Second, women on the front lines. Third, the promise of freedom. Fourth, shattered Native American alliances. And finally, liberty, but for whom? Let's dive in.
Section 1. A complex civil war. To truly understand the revolution, you have to look at it not just as a rebellion against an empire, but as a bitter, divisive civil war that completely tore communities apart. It's a pretty shocking demographic reality that 20% of the colonial population were actually loyalists. These were people who remained completely sympathetic to the British Crown. And they weren't just isolated individuals scattered around. They were concentrated in very distinct communities, often living among large plantation owners down in the Tidewater region and in South Carolina. So yes, the Patriots had widespread support, but this was absolutely not a unanimous uprising.
And this wasn't just some casual difference of political opinion. Approximately 25,000 loyalists actively took up arms and fought for the British throughout the war. In fact, loyalist militia units, like the British Legion, provided some of the absolute most effective troops in the entire British service. Loyalties were incredibly messy. Just imagine fighting your own brother or your next-door neighbor over a political allegiance. It was brutal.
Section 2. Women on the front lines. We usually relegate women to the home front in these historical narratives, but actually, the realities of the Revolutionary War were startlingly different. Women were deeply, deeply embedded in the war effort. Thousands served as camp followers, accompanying armies on the march. I mean, even Martha Washington visited her husband at various camps. They provided absolutely critical logistics. They sold goods, they performed vital tasks as medics in military hospitals, and many acted as spies for both sides. Take Sybil Ludington, who's often called the female Paul Revere, for alerting militias, though historians still love to debate the exact details of her ride. And some women even took on direct combat roles. What's truly mind-blowing here is the sheer courage of the women who went entirely undercover. Anna Maria Lane and Deborah Sampson literally disguised themselves as men just to enter combat. Lane actually fought bravely alongside her husband and was severely wounded at the Battle of Germantown. It was an act of absolute badassery that was later officially recognized by the Virginia General Assembly. These women literally bled for a cause that barely even recognized their basic rights.
Section 3. The promise of freedom. Let this number sink in for a second. At the start of the war, the population of the 13 colonies included an estimated 500,000 enslaved people, predominantly forced into labor on southern plantations. This massive enslaved population instantly became a crucial, heavily weighed factor in the military strategies of both sides. I want you to imagine being caught right in the middle of this war, trapped between a rebelling master demanding liberty and a British king suddenly offering you emancipation as a weapon of war. It brings up a painful irony and an impossible dilemma. In late 1775, the British issued Dunmore's Proclamation. They promised freedom to any patriot-owned slaves who were willing to bear arms for the crown. Now, to be clear, this was a highly tactical move just to deprive patriots of their labor force. But meanwhile, the Continental Army, the guys fighting under the grand banner of liberty, initially barred black patriots from enlisting at all. And that was a policy driven by George Washington himself.
Watching this unfold over time is really fascinating, because it wasn't necessarily a grand moral awakening that eventually changed American policy. By January 1778, Washington had to convince Congress to allow black recruits simply to replace massive troop losses from disease and desertion. They just needed the manpower. And the very next month, the 1st Rhode Island Regiment was formed, prominently including former slaves.
Ultimately, around 5,000 African Americans served in the Continental Army and Navy, with thousands more stepping up in militias or acting as spies and teamsters. The resulting disruption to the institution of slavery was immense. In South Carolina alone, nearly 25,000 enslaved people. To put that into perspective, that is about 30% of the state's entire enslaved population fled, migrated, or died during the conflict. It completely upended the plantation economy, both during and well after the war.
Section 4. Shattered Native American Alliances. For most Native Americans living east of the Mississippi River, the Union of the 13 colonies was absolutely not seen as a beacon of liberty. It was viewed as a massive existential threat to their territory, and the war just devastated their indigenous political structures. Roughly 13,000 Native Americans ended up fighting for the British, and the incredibly powerful Haudenosaunee or Iroquois Confederacy was literally shattered by this choice. The Seneca, Onondaga, and Cayuga sided with the British, while the Tuscarora and Oneida sided with the Americans. The Mohawk Nation actually split their factions entirely. The war forced tribes and sometimes even close neighbors to fight against each other.
And the retaliation out on the frontier was nothing short of brutal. To put a stop to raids by British allied natives, the Continental Army launched the Sullivan Expedition in 1779. This was a devastating, scorched earth campaign. We are talking about more than 4,000 Patriot soldiers intentionally destroying over 40 Iroquois villages. They burned 160,000 bushels of maize to the ground. It left British allied tribes completely destitute for the winter, and it permanently broke the Haudenosaunee Confederacy as an independent power in the region. Which brings us to our final section. Section 5. Liberty, but for whom?
Let's zoom back out to the macro view for a second. When the dust settled with the 1783 Treaty of Paris, we have to evaluate the true, lasting cost of this conflict. The aftermath reveals a really stark contrast between those grand ideals we talked about and some very grim realities. The British ended up evacuating 8,000 to 10,000 freed blacks from places like Charleston and New York. Conversely, many black patriots who had explicitly fought for the U.S. were just returned to their masters post-war, completely ignoring earlier promises of freedom. Native Americans, regardless of which side they fought on, were entirely excluded from the peace negotiations that carved up their own lands. And ultimately, the Southern economy's deep dependence firmly entrenched the institution of slavery right into the bedrock of the new nation.
Our source material hits the nail on the head here, noting, while many were uneasy over the contradiction of demanding liberty for some, yet denying it to others, the dependence of Southern states on slave labor made abolition too great a challenge. It perfectly captures the tragic hypocrisy embedded right at the foundation of the new republic.
So, I want to leave you with this final thought for today's explainer. If a revolution fought in the name of liberty fails to end slavery, if it ignores the rights of the women who literally bled for it, and if it completely displaces and ignores its native allies and enemies alike, whose liberty was actually won, it is a messy, deeply complicated legacy, and it's one that absolutely demands we look past the mythology to understand the true human cost of American independence. Thanks for joining me on The Explainer. Catch you next time.